What? No. Yeah. Okay. Today we're going to talk about Cinema4D. I want to talk about some of the basic tools. I want to talk about some modeling stuff. I want to talk about some rigging basics, right? Using the joint tool, using binding those joints to geometry, and then texturing geometry, and then lighting and rendering. So last week in preparation for this, I started playing around again with the Cinema4D rigging tools. It had been a minute, but it just really is a great tool set. And so let's go ahead and dive in. I was just playing around with some very quick character designs, right? So I got this guy with his big long neck here, and some not so great looking arms. Excuse me. And I ended the week. The last rig that I had built and played with was what culminated in doing a quick render, because I wanted to have something to show, was doing this little render test right here. And I put the link. I'm going to go ahead and kill the audio, though I did add a little audio. Just this little character. He kind of looks like a toy. He's got that somewhat plasticky, somewhat rubbery kind of material. Supposed to be cute and funny, but let's just talk about the tools in Cinema4D required to go ahead and build something like this. So let's see, we've got this rig. Here was the full shot of him kind of turning. Let me actually see shading and lines. He kind of turns, looks, gets some bad news. Oh, it's so terrible. Nope, now he's happy again. And then pew, 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 laser noise. And just did a really super simple one top-down kind of halo light, a single rim light that's going to give you some of this rim edge. And then I actually have this kind of pink box that he's sitting on, actually has a little bit of a luminance in the actual material. So it's kind of pushing a little bit of information that way as well. So let's just go to a totally new scene. Okay, so the first thing that I would draw attention to is some of the tools that I'm bringing out of the menus and putting into my panel here. And the tool sets that I'm bringing out are, and if you need to know how to bring them out, like when you open a menu, it shows you this little dotted bar. And if you click on that, it gives you this dockable UI interface that you can put anywhere else in your scene. Now, I already have my selection panel out, so I'm going to close this. So my selection tools, I like to bring those out. When you're doing modeling, you're going to have to switch sometimes between the various modes, and you're going to end up selecting a lot of polygons, so that's really useful. Then under Mesh, I go to Create Tools, and I bring that out as well, and I put that right down here, and that's like Create Point, Create Polygon, the Knife tool, the Weld tool, all that good stuff. And the last one, since we are going to be rigging up our geometry and moving it around, is I bring out the entire character panel so that I can get at the joint tool. And that's basically what we need in there. We will have to come back to the command, but we won't need it that much. So we're going to start by just bringing a cube into our scene. And I would tell you that in each of these previous little tests, I modeled each of these starting from a single cube. And that is not all that uncommon, right? Just start from a single piece of geometry, and let's go ahead and start building this out. So the first thing we need to do with this cube is hit C, which is going to turn it from, I believe what they call a parametric object, which is like an adjustable object, into an actual piece of geometry. So I'm going to hit Command Z on that. If you look at just bringing in a regular cube, it gives you all these kind of live dials where you can change the X, change the Y, change the segments. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to hit C. But then if you can see it on the screen, it takes away all those kind of live settings. So we're going to begin by taking a look at our three modes that we can model in, and that is point mode, edge mode, and polygon mode. So I'm going to select polygon mode, come over to my live selection, and it's just like it sounds, right? I could select this face, I could select this face. But what I want to do is start at the bottom by pulling a neck out of this. I'm going to treat the cube as the head of the object here. So the first thing I need to do is go to my knife tool. And the knife tool is great. It's going to allow us to cut segments into this geometry. And a couple of options to look at within the knife tool are its basic mode, right? So line is just like you'd think, creates a single line. That's very rough. I want to go ahead and do loops, right? So in modeling for a rig, edge loops are typically the way that we're going to cut our geometry so that we can keep lots of subdivisions within the geometry so that when we twist it around and bend it and twist its neck, things are going to hold up for us. So let's go ahead and basically cut a box in a box here. I'm going to kind of come in here. Actually, I need to also uncheck restrict to selection. Just go ahead and make it all the way around the object. There we go. I'm actually going to come in a little bit on that one. Something like that. I'm going to come back here. We'll do it a little closer to the back of the head. So I'm going to start by cutting some edge loops into our geometry here. And then I'm going to come back to my live selection tool, click away, and just grab this bottom piece. Now I'm going to come back to my create tools down here and go ahead and hit extrude and start pulling an extrusion just from that piece of geometry there, just from that edge, that polygon face. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to set up my little modeling workflow by taking my cube and putting it in a hypernerb. If you're not familiar with the idea of a hypernerb, it basically is an object that will subdivide your geometry, right? Adding more detail, but it's going to guess. It's basically going to go like 50% between your edge loops, right? So if I have a point here, if I go to point mode, if I have a point here and a point here, when I turn on the hypernerb, it curves it out, right? Like it basically will kind of 50% guess it a little bit. Now, if I were to go back to kind of my faces mode, polygon mode, and come to my knife and do another edge loop super close to this edge loop, let's see what happens. You see what happened there? Now I've like moved that middle point, so now its curve on this side is kind of super small. So if I turn off the hypernerb, you can see, hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of what it does, right? So I'm going to take that out. And the reason I like to model with the hypernerbs is just to kind of get a feel for what the shape is going to look like. So I'm actually going to extrude again, do a new extrusion so that it lays an edge loop right there in the neck. I'll go about that far. I'm going to add another edge loop. Uh-oh, is my mouse dying? Sorry guys, 1 second. There we go. Okay, let's do that again. Let's add an edge loop there. I'm going to add another one by clicking again and extruding again. But now this time, let's go super long on the neck. I'm going to hit T to actually scale this face a little bit. I want to start creating a little bit of a shape here. I'm going to extrude yet again. Start creating a little bit of this bean kind of body and start extruding that out a little bit as well. So this is kind of what I was doing with my other little guy, kind of playing with it. And if I turn off the hypernerb, you see, not rocket science, right? Like I'm basically extruding out and then scaling to try to get a shape. But when I'm modeling with the hypernerb on, it gives me a bit of a sense of kind of exactly how it's going to look when I subdivide it. Once you hit the extrude button, you could then grab that face and just go forever. The reason I was kind of going just a little bit and then stopping is because I wanted there to be a subdivision so that I could play this little game of kind of where I scale it up. So let's now quickly, now that you got the basic idea, I'm going to go back to my knife tool here in my create panel. Let's cut out some ears, right? Let's cut out some really cool, and ears are typically about even with the eyes. So kind of wherever I imagine the eyes being, is where I'm going to start the top of the ear. And I'm going to make these ears pretty bulky. I'm going to have the ears come to right about there. Now I'm going to go back to my live selection tool. So now that we cut our pieces, I'm just going to come in to where I think these ears could go. And again, come back to my extrusion tool, right? And start extruding this out. Now I'm going to go pretty far here because the hypernerb is going to take it back, right? Pretty decently. Let's just turn that off for now. The next thing I want to do is now go ahead and create some geometry actually on the inner ear, right? Some of this inner kind of inner dents and all that. So now we're going to use a tool called the extrude inner, right? I want to actually pull in. And if you just select a single face and use the extrude inner, it's going to do this little game, right? Where it just pulls in from every point. And let's go ahead and do something right about there. And then again, now I'm going to choose extrude, but extrude backwards, right? And extrusion could either go out or in. It actually depends on where you take the mouse. And like we were saying, Mike, it does go infinitely. If I just grab this handle, I could go back infinitely. We don't want to do that, but I'm just going to come back to right about there. And then I'm going to turn my hypernerbs back on and see what I'm getting, right? So very kind of monkey ears, super rounded on the edges because I don't have any more subdivision. I think that looks kind of cool, actually. I think we could go with that for now. I'm just going to turn this off. Now, along the way, I was actually kind of texturing as I go. I think we'll come back to that. So one thing I want to do is do a super prominent brow line. So I'm going to grab my selection tool and select these top 3 pieces here. Yeah, let's keep it that thick. And let's just go extrude. Let's just pull this out. Let's kind of have that brow line go straight out like that. And gosh, you know what I forgot to do? I actually wanted my ears to be only select visible elements. I'm going to grab my selection tool here. I actually wanted my ears to be, to kind of come up slightly on the outside to create a little bit more of a shape. Right, so that's a little more like elf. This would be a little more like sad giraffe type of look. I'm just going to go up slightly just to kind of break that line up a little bit. Let me see what the hypernerb's doing with it. We could kind of pull this up. And again, it's to taste, right? Like if there's, you know, most of the time, if you were really doing this for a film, you'd probably want to have sketches first and kind of a model sheet to know the exact final design on your character. I think that looks great. I'm not going to go crazy with pulling those points up. But the brow line, I think that looks pretty cool. Let's go ahead and pull a nose into here. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to turn off my hypernerb. And I really would like to see my line shading. And I am going to select my cube and go back to my knife tool. So I need to cut some more edge loops in here that give me a place to put the nose. And I think that's going to be, but I really just want to restrict to selection. So I'm actually just going to do some line tool here. And I need to restrict to selection. And I'm going to come in here and just select this area. And let's go ahead and see if I can cut, because I think the nose needs to be right about here. I just don't want the top of it to be that high. So what about that? What if I just cut that line in there? And then come back to my selection tool. Oops. Nope. Live selection, click away. Let's grab this one. Let's go ahead and get an extrusion going on the nose. So that kind of comes out a little bit. If I look at my hypernerb, that's not going to be a ton. So I think what I want to do is do what I did on my other guy and put a lot more detail in the nose. Like I think I did one version where I just had kind of a stumpy nose and it looked pretty cool the way the light was hitting it. But I think I'd prefer putting a bit more detail in that nose. Now, turning the hypernerb on allows me to like really take a look at this extrusion and kind of see like what are we going for. Now we're really going into like elf territory there. We'll pull this back a little more modest. I'm going to turn off the hypernerb. And I'm going to go ahead and put another cut, another subdivision, just using the line tool directly down the center of this guy. Then I'm going to select each piece individually and come back to an extrude inner and do this kind of number, where I'm actually going to create kind of like a nostril shape. And then I can use my selection tool to come in here, and let's extrude those guys back. Turn on my hypernerb, see how it's holding up. So it's a little that kind of pig nose look that I was doing on the other model, which I think is okay. So that I think is looking all right. I think we could turn this guy off, come back, and now let's go into point mode. I'll just use my live selection tool. So this could actually get a bit hairy. I need to make sure I select all these. I kind of want to pull the nostril height way down, like so. Like maybe we push it more in this direction. That'll kind of change that shape. It's looking a little too stretched for me there, so I'm just going to pull this down a little bit. And so I still got my selection tool. Let me turn this off. I might also want to play with the bottom side of this. So this is modeling in C4D. This is, it can be slow, but it really is just about learning, you know, kind of learning through trial and error a little bit, like just understanding what the tools do, understanding kind of this process. So we'll kind of pull those in a little bit. That's working a little better for me. So now we're getting this general shape, right? I'm not going to do any arms. I won't go crazy. Like if you look at this guy, you know, and you can imagine the process being very similar, right? Like you could just go to the side of the body and pull arms out, right? Extrude arms out and do that kind of thing. If I go away from my camera. And this guy had a hell of a lot of geometry, and I did this guy in like 2 hours, so like some of the details are very, very bad. I'm doing like a global axis tool there. Let me just go back. So let's just stick with this guy. I think I'd like to be seeing everything above the horizon line here. So one of the reasons I really like to work in this flow, where I'm just kind of having this super basic one is I could always turn off the hypernerb if the scene is becoming too bogged down from all the geometry. And even within the hypernerbs, you can see the subdivision editor. I could say, well, I'd actually like to see 3 subdivisions per division, right? So that like super duper smooths it out. Or I could say, just subdivide it once. Now it's a little more blocky. By default, it's at 2. And you can even see like it's starting to crunch in here. So if we go to 3, is it going to starts to smooth some of that out. 4, if we were like feature film production and we needed absolute perfection on those curves. But just for the sake of now, let's just keep it at our default of 2. That's going to be plenty. I'll make some new materials. I was just kind of sharing my other materials. So I was kind of using a Simpsons yellow for the body. And I'll just globally put that on the cube here. But then I was trying to like have some accent colors. So let's turn off the hypernerb. And this is where we can use our individual live selection tool to apply some other textures. So let's go ahead and create a black material for the eyebrow. Let's just have a super strong brow line. And okay, so here's the whole game, right? If you just have these selected, and I used a yellow, let me actually take that off because you can't see it. If I have that selected and I grab my texture and just drag and drop, it's going to put that black only on those. And if you look over at your object here, it adds the texture and then it adds this little orange triangle, right? This is a selection tag, which is basically saying it's linked to this texture. And if you see down here in the selection, it says polygon selection 1, which is this guy. And that's basically how you can apply. So let's do it again. Let's do the inner ear. Let's do the inner ear Yeah, and I was kind of using, like I was just going opposite color wheel on the yellow, just go to like a blue, maybe like a blue-green. And again, I have those selected, so I'm just gonna drag and drop and try to hover over top. And so again, we get that same thing, right? We get the material, we get a selection tag. So let's see. And I was just trying to do this just to break up a little bit of, let's put the black on the inner nostril. Do we want to do that? Let's actually put the blue. So it's creating these selection tags. Now, if I turn my HyperNerd back on, in my opinion, I really like how it comes out. Like, it just really looks a lot more detailed in there. And it looks painted on, in effect, but for what we were doing. And now if I just globally put that, I've got to make sure I move that texture underneath or closer to the actual cube. Because I don't know if you saw at first how when I pulled that out, it actually covered up all the other textures. So then we start getting something like this, and we can see some of the roughness, and we would really need to go in and add more subdivisions, or just increase the HyperNerd, right? So let's see. 3 smooths some of that stuff out. It does. Okay, so that is kind of modeling 101, right? We can really quickly get something going. We could go all day on this guy, right? Maybe we could select something on the top and try to add some hair. We could pull geometry out of the body, maybe do some arms. But for now, for the sake of time, we've already been going half the time. I just want to talk about some rigging basics. And I don't want to cover rigging because I think everyone's going to be creating rigged characters all the time, but because just understanding the basics of how to bind joints to geometry or to a mesh can be valuable for all sorts of reasons, right? Like there was a tutorial many years ago on Grayscale Gorilla where one of his guest speakers was doing a tutorial on a bullet going through an old school microphone. And as the bullet would go through the microphone, the geometry of the 3D microphone started to peel back. And in the tutorial, he shows you how he uses the joint tool to just get in there, add some joints to the geometry, and then just peel that mesh back. So even in a visual effects context, or anytime you just need to do something a little bit irregular with a 3D shape, like molding something into a perfect shape, the joint tool seems to be a really good tool for that. So I'm going to grab the joint tool and come to my front view, and I'm just going to create a joint kind of spine here for this guy. I'm going to hold down Command and click to lay my first spot. Then I'm going to hold Command and click and kind of follow my subdivision lines and just keep going. And it's creating a great little chain here. Come to here, come to here, and come to right about there. So that is creating a joint tool. Now, if we needed to create arms, let's say, the one big thing you would need to know how to do is use the cemetry tool within the joint tool, right? So if I go to my joint tool, there's this little tab right here that says cemetry. Make sure I'm not blocking it. And so right now it says cemetry none, but if I go to cemetry draw, now everything I do is going to try to mirror it symmetrically. So I need to come into my joint chain here, and let's say the arms were actually all the way down at the base of this second joint. I'm just going to hit Command, click, come on. Oh, the other thing I need to do on the joint tool is say root null, because I want the root to be the joint that I have selected. So there we go. So I Command, click, and you see it's creating a symmetrical joint chain off of this center joint. So now the reason that's important is because it's all parented to the root, right? So if I come back to my regular tools and I bring my root around, these arms are coming with it. The reason using the cemetry is great, right? So you don't have to draw these twice and like maybe it's slightly off. You need it to be exactly perfect if you're creating a set of arms for your rig. So using that cemetry tool and then going off of an existing joint. So what we need to do now is the process of binding these joints to this mesh, right? So I need to select the geometry. I'm just going to turn off the hyperNURBs for now. I need to select this geometry. Go ahead and select all these points. Go into character and say bind. So let's see if we did that correctly. Sometimes I mess it up. Nope, we did bind it. So now wherever these joints move, this geometry is going with it, right? So I've just selected the last set of joints or so. So let's see, one thing we want to do is come into this tag, and this is called the weight tag. And the first thing we want to do is say set bind pose. So that is basically saying the positions of these joints as they currently are is the default pose, right? So if I were to come in here and start to get crazy and this guy's doing crazy stuff and I'm like, oh crap, I need to get back to my base pose, I'll just hit reset bind pose and it's going to jump back to that home pose effectively. So let's see, we could turn on our hyperNURBs so we're seeing it a little better. And basically what I'm doing, I'm not going to create a full rig. This is like a very basic overview. Is I'm just selecting the last one, the last 5 joints or so, and just playing with their rotation variables here on banking, on pitch. So he's going to go back and forth. And then maybe we could key in a little bit of kind of side to side movement. And this is the point where now I would need to look at how the rig is holding up, right? Like we could go ahead and render a little bit and see, is it starting to break down in any way? So let's see. So it's not great, right? It's not great. This rig would need a heck of a lot of work. You see the ear stretching like crazy. And that's where you get into more kind of advanced weight painting and things like that. But let's just go ahead and, oh, look at that. The nose is like super collapsing when I come forward on pitch there. So that would be an issue of going back in and subdividing the geometry a heck of a lot more. So the other day when I did that little short on YouTube, right, where this guy, he's kind of got his back to you and then he turns and he's got these little head darts, kind of like a pose of like, what? And he's got the head down and then he's triumphant at the end. So putting some keyframes on this guy, let's quickly talk about that. So I'm just going to go to like the last 4 or so. Let's try that first pose. And my rig this time is not as good as my rig last time because I spent a little more time on it. But effectively, I could just control click and set a keyframe. Now I'm setting a keyframe on all these joints. And then maybe it could come, he does like a ½ second. Maybe he overshoots a little bit, kind of comes right there. Maybe he holds, I'll paste that for like a full second, and then maybe he does kind of a head dart back the other direction, but also pitch. Maybe he kind of like, and maybe it's just the last few joints. Let's see what that looks like. Kind of a head tilt. Yeah, a little bit of a pitch. Maybe he like, get into this pose. So I'm just doing some like super quick pose to pose, kind of blocking. And then maybe he holds that for 10 or 15 frames or so. And then comes back this direction. Oops, nope, I want to go negative on that. I'm just putting him in some poses here that I can see maybe how our rig's doing, and I've got a little bit of overlapping action there I'm going to need to fix. Not good. Looks like he's doing like a head toss. But just to show you the super basics, right? So now I could, and you know what's a really good example to show on animation is let's quickly create a joint chain again, because I want to talk a little bit about keyframing. Let's go ahead and create a joint chain that gets much smaller. All right, so we could almost think of this as like a tail or like a tree branch or something. Let's leave the base. No, let's rotate the base joint, but not bank, not pitch. Yeah, let's do this. Let's go ahead and throw this guy pretty hardcore 30-degree angle. Let's go forward like 2 seconds, say -30 all the way across. So right now, all the joints are moving in unison. And let's go ahead and throw this out a little bit. And then like 120, we'll go back this direction. So we've got these two, here's a pose, here's a pose, here's a pose. They're all moving at the exact same moment. Let's bring open our timeline though and start to bring these out. So we know that one principle of animation is called overlapping action. And so let's overlap this action, meaning the base joint will move first and the top of it should drag, right? So it should be offset in time ever so slightly. So I'm just going to grab joint 7, come forward a few frames, select joint 6, which also selects everything underneath it. Let me make sure everybody can see this. Grab joint 5, bring that out a little bit, grab joint 4, bring that out a little bit, grab joint 3. And hopefully I'm exaggerating this enough that we'll be able to see. Bring joint 1. We should be able to see the difference in just a single pose. Now you see a little bit of overlapping action. So let's see if we're getting that effect. There we go. Feels like that top piece is just dragging ever so slightly, right? So it's a bit of a drag, a bit of an overlap, and getting that going. And I was playing with that on the arms the other day, right? Of making sure that if you would kind of pose the arm in one position, that you get some of that overlapping action, some of that drag on the arm. And that's, in this instance, just as simple as kind of making sure that every single joint isn't moving on the exact same timing. And again, I think stuff like this can be useful in a whole bunch of contexts. It doesn't have to be a character-driven film, right? I could definitely imagine using this tool set for, like we said, trees or plants, maybe even if we had some leaves that we wanted to rig up and kind of do something. Visual effects instances where maybe if we needed the ground to break and crack up, we could just put joints, on a piece of mesh on the ground and kind of maybe create a visual effect of some kind. So let's go back to this guy with this terrible posing here. And basically, I think I'm just going to pull back on some of these because I don't like the way that's looking. So for now, I just want to put him, calling him a him, I want to put him in a pose that I want to light. So let's say kind of looking out towards the horizon. So kind of chin up, head back. And that's not going to, So this is kind of where we'll work with our light. So on my little, on this little film here, we'll call it a film, even though it took one day. I've got this volumetric light kind of playing, this moment where the character's sad. This kind of spotlight comes on, and you can see it. You can see its volume. It's hard to tell on the compression, but the model is actually interacting with some of that volumetric light. And let's just talk about putting that together. The basics on that is, first of all, just looking at our settings, right? Saying visible light. Yes, I want some volumetric light. Can start to pull that out a little bit. On details, I'm going to choose a physically accurate fall off. So that says inverse square, physically accurate. And that starts to give me this little effect. Now, I don't have any other lights in the scene yet, so it's not going to look great. I want that fall off to be a little bigger, that decay. I'm going to create another light that is my rim light. Do it about eye level on my character. And lighting always typically has to happen to a camera. So, maybe my rim light needs to inch this way to the left so I can kind of get this line right here. Or if the shot was different, maybe the rim light needs to fall this way so I get a little bit of this hot edge right here. But I'm going to add just a bit of warmth, right? I'm not going to use pure white on my lights. Actually, before I duplicate that. So on this backlight, I am going to say, show me area shadows. And I can do this same little, I almost had this idea that these guys were like statues or something, or like awards that were come to life, little toys. So I had them on these kind of platforms. And that's going to start to pull that kind of dramatic shadow from the back. But I've got to have a fill light unless we're going super dramatic. But I can pull that back. And now we could start to dial this fill light in. So let's try it at like 50% because I do want some contrast. And I'm going to add just ever so slightly a touch of blue to it. And I need to deselect that light. So I'm starting to get this look. Need to work with the texture a bit. And one thing I was trying to play with was getting just kind of playing around a little bit with some global illumination type settings here. And I'm just going to turn on GI. Now we're going to keep all our settings super, super low. I'm going to say low on all these samples, on these top two boxes. On general, I'm just going to say still image. Diffuse depth of 1, that's a big setting. Then I'm going to add an ambient occlusion, but take this from a black to a gray. I want some of those contact shadows, but I don't want it to be like insane. So you can see what GI gives us is just way, way better than the standard render. And because I have a GI object, it actually is bouncing some pink light. You can see it on the chin a little bit. Let me see how that blue is looking. The blue's probably getting a touch washed in all this. It's not too bad. So that's a lot of the basics. Live selection, mode, normal, soft selection. Let's actually try that, Kamal. That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. How could we test that very quickly? Let's turn off the hypernerb. And you see, because I have so few polys, so let's see. Live selection. Yeah, live selection, soft selection, radius 10. So why can't I select anything? Oh, not in polygon mode. There we go. Let's see. So if we select the ear with soft selection turned on and then add the blue, what does that do? It doesn't appear to do much. That didn't appear to change it. Maybe it's because I have the other tag on. I think the soft selection only, I don't think it works on the selection tag like that. Soft selection appears to be, it just kind of like, I think that's more of a modeling tool where it like kind of averages the selection the actual geometry. But yeah, why wouldn't we be able? So let's like apply black to that and see what happens. Nope, just went on the hypernerb. Let's turn off the hypernerb. But you see, the selection tag works along the edges of the actual piece of geometry. So yeah, that's a great question, Kamal. If we needed to blend, if we needed to more smoothly blend these lines in, then we'd have to get into UV mapping and use a Photoshop file to kind of unwrap this model and then go into Photoshop and paint those softer edges. I believe EJ Hassenfratz of iDesign Tutorials has quite a bit of, gosh, what would you call it? UV painting, UV mapping out of cinema type of content. Thanks everybody for hanging out. I hope that there was something in here that was useful for you, whether it's just in the modeling stuff, using hypernerbs, kind of getting your mind around the basics of this rigging tool set. I think there's just so many uses that this could be useful, right? Whether it's visual effects or whether it even is little characters, right? Like we created a little character in 30 minutes. So the tool set is just so robust that you can really start to get something going really quickly.